At an auction in Montana, laughter erupted when a crooked-legged horse stumbled into view. No one wanted him, except a quiet farmer named Ethan. What began as mockery soon turned into a bond that shocked the entire valley. From storms that nearly tore them apart, to a choice that proved loyalty stronger than fate. This is the story of a man and a horse who refused to be forgotten. The old loudspeaker crackled above the dusty barn, announcing yet another horse to be sold. It was late afternoon in Bozeman, Montana, the kind of fall day when the air carried the dry scent of hay and the chill of winter already whispered in the wind. Men leaned against the rails with paper cups of coffee in their hands. Women huddled in jackets, and a cluster of teenagers kicked at the straw, restless with boredom. Then the doors slid open, and a young gray gelding stumbled forward. His legs, twisted inward like crooked branches, barely held him. For one fragile second, silence filled the yard. Then it broke. Laughter rolled through the crowd like a wave. "That's no horse! That's scrap metal with hair!" a rancher shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. A boy whistled as if calling a stray dog, and another flicked a pebble that skittered by the gelding's hooves. The animal flinched, but did not fight back. His eyes, wide and dim, darted across the faces around him, finding not pity, not care, only mockery. The auctioneer, a man named Hank, with a red face and a voice trained to sound cheerful, shifted uncomfortably. "Here we got a 3-year-old gelding," he said, reading from his notes. "Obvious deformity, trouble with locomotion. Let's start at $200. He waited. No hands rose. He tried again. 100. Still nothing. Someone muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Wouldn't even make dog food." The crowd laughed again, louder this time, as if cruelty was part of the entertainment. At the back row, a man sat alone, his cap pulled low, his hands rough from years of wood and soil. Ethan Cole, a farmer who rarely spoke more than he needed to, shifted in his chair. His life had been a long season of losses. A child buried too young, a wife gone because silence had grown heavier than love, a home held together by duty alone. He watched the gelding sway in the center of that merciless circle. The world had already decided the animal was useless. Yet something in those crooked legs echoed the fractures inside him. Hank sighed into the microphone. "All right then, $40 just to move him along. Who'll take him?" The words barely hung in the air before Ethan's hand rose. Slowly, deliberately, as if to say, "I see what you throw away, and I'll carry it." Heads turned. Whispers crackled. "He's joking," someone sneered. "A waste of money." Another voice called out, "You could buy a second-hand radio for that." But Ethan didn't flinch. He stood, pulled 2 wrinkled bills from his back pocket, and walked to the rail. "Sold," Hank declared, half relieved, half bewildered. The gavel hit the block, and with that dull thud, the room shifted. The laughter didn't stop. It grew, but now it carried a note of disbelief. People shook their heads, muttering that Ethan had lost what little sense he had left. "God help him," one man said, shaking his head as if mourning a fool. Ethan pushed open the gate and stepped inside the corral. The gelding's ears twitched, his body tensed as if bracing for another blow. But Ethan did not reach for the rope. He crouched instead, laying the 2 bills gently on the dirt floor, then kept his hand there, palm open, as though he had nothing to prove. The crowd quieted for a moment, puzzled. What kind of man kneels for a broken animal? No words passed between them, just the rough breath of a farmer and the shallow pant of a horse that had never been chosen. After a long minute, Ethan whispered, barely audible, "Come on, boy." He didn't tug, didn't order. He simply rose and began walking toward the exit. The gelding staggered, then took a step. Another. The crowd jeered again, calling Ethan mad, but the horse followed, clumsy and halting, yet unwilling to stay behind. Outside, Ethan's old pickup truck waited, its paint flaking, its trailer patched with rusted steel. A man in the crowd shouted after him, "Now you're not just alone, you're crazy too." But Ethan didn't answer. He closed the trailer gate, the sound of metal ringing through the chilly air, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The laughter of the crowd faded as the truck rumbled down the dirt road, leaving only a swirl of dust behind. For the first time in years, Ethan felt his chest ache, not from emptiness, but from something alive, restless. He didn't know what to call it: compassion, foolishness, hope. But he knew one thing, as the gray gelding trembled in the dark trailer behind him. Sometimes the broken are the only ones worth carrying home. The road from Bozeman wound through the valley like a scar across the land. Ethan's old pickup rattled with every rut, the trailer behind him swaying against the weight of its passenger. Inside, the young gelding pressed himself into the corner, his twisted legs braced against the wooden floor. He did not whinny, did not kick. He simply endured, as if expecting the world to jolt and punish him again. Each bump in the road echoed through Ethan's chest, reminding him of the fragility of what he had just carried away from the auction yard. The sun dipped lower, smearing the horizon with the dull red of a fading ember. Montana evenings carried a loneliness that Ethan had grown used to, but tonight, the silence inside the cab was different. He could hear the rhythm of the horse's breath behind him, ragged, cautious. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His calloused hands were used to splitting firewood, repairing fences, sanding down crooked planks. Fixing what was broken had been his life's work, yet nothing he had ever mended prepared him for the weight of another living soul's survival. When the truck finally pulled into the gravel drive of his farm, dusk had settled. The house stood at the edge of the Gallatin Valley, its wooden siding faded to the color of ash. A barn leaned tiredly against the wind, and fields of harvested corn stubble stretched toward the dark line of the Bridger Mountains. Ethan killed the engine. For a moment, he didn't move. The house had been silent for years, its walls filled only with the memory of footsteps that no longer passed through them. Tonight, he wasn't returning alone. He opened the trailer. The gelding's ears shot back. Nostrils flaring, Ethan stood still, letting the cool air drift between them. "Easy," he murmured, though his voice cracked with the weight of words rarely spoken. The horse hesitated, shifting his weight awkwardly, the twisted legs trembling. Ethan did not pull the rope. He simply stepped aside, giving space. Slowly, painfully, Thistle, the name Ethan whispered in his mind, though not yet aloud, lowered his head and shuffled down the ramp. Each step echoed across the yard like a drumbeat of defiance against the judgment of strangers. Inside the barn, Ethan had cleared a small stall. Fresh straw lined the floor, though the scent of old wood and dust still clung to the beams. He lit a lantern, its glow soft against the shadows. The gelding stood rigid, eyes darting at every creak of the structure. Ethan placed a bucket of water in one corner and a small pile of hay in the other. He didn't try to coax him closer. He knew trust wasn't fed by force. It was grown by patience. Later, Ethan sat on the porch steps, the night wrapping around him like an old coat. The mountains rose dark and immovable, stars pricking through the sky one by one. He held a chipped mug of coffee, though the liquid inside had long gone cold. His gaze drifted to the barn, where a dim light still glowed. For years, his nights had ended like this, silence pressing in, his thoughts circling back to the same grave beneath a cottonwood tree where his boy lay. Noah had been 9, cheeks still round, laughter still clumsy. A snowmobile accident had taken him on a winter afternoon that Ethan replayed endlessly, but could never change. His wife, Sarah, had left not long after. She said silence was heavier than grief, and she could no longer carry it. Ethan never begged her to stay. Words had always failed him. Now the quiet wasn't empty. It carried the fragile presence of another wounded soul. Inside that barn was a creature dismissed as worthless, yet alive, breathing, trembling, enduring. Ethan thought of all the things the men at the auction had said. Not even worth a bullet, waste of money. Their laughter still rang in his ears, but here, under the Montana stars, it seemed far away. What mattered was that the horse was here, and for reasons he couldn't yet name, that mattered more than his own comfort. The following morning, frost glazed the ground silver. Ethan rose before the sun, as he always had. Habit guided him. Boil water, grind coffee beans, stack firewood by the stove. Yet as he walked toward the barn, he felt the old rhythm of his routine break. A soft shuffling came from inside. He opened the stall door slowly, careful not to startle. The gelding stood in the corner, straw clinging to his legs, eyes wary. The hay from the night before remained untouched, the water barely rippled. Ethan crouched, his joints stiff, and simply rested his hand palm down on the straw. The horse flicked an ear, his breath fogged the air. For long minutes, nothing happened. Ethan's knees ached, his hand grew cold against the floor, but he remained still. Finally, the gelding lowered his head a fraction, nostrils quivering. He did not step closer, but he did not retreat either. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was the absence of fear. And sometimes, absence was the beginning of presence. Ethan rose and left the stall, closing the door gently. As he walked back to the house, the sky over the valley began to brighten, light spreading like a promise across the ridges. Inside, his coffee steamed on the table, untouched. He opened a worn notebook that had gathered dust in a drawer. Once, Sarah had kept lists there, groceries, bills, chores. Ethan took a pencil and wrote a single line. He came home last night, broken, but not gone. Outside, the barn stood quiet again, but the silence was no longer hollow. Something had shifted. It was small, nearly invisible, but Ethan felt it in his bones. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself with trumpets, but arrives like the first thin crack of dawn. The morning air in Gallatin Valley carried the faint scent of pine smoke from distant chimneys, and frost clung stubbornly to the fence rails like shards of glass. Ethan walked toward the barn with a pail of warm water balanced in one hand, his boots crunching against the frozen gravel. The gelding stood exactly where he had left him the night before, head lowered, body rigid, eyes half hidden beneath a rough forelock. His twisted legs looked even more fragile in the pale light, bent like branches that had grown in the wrong direction. Ethan paused at the door, listening to the steady sound of the animal's breathing, the rhythm of fear and endurance. He set the bucket down gently, not wanting the clang of metal to break the fragile stillness. Then, instead of reaching for the rope or pushing the hay closer, Ethan stepped into the stall and slowly lowered himself onto the straw-covered floor. His knees protested, and his back stiffened. But he didn't care. He spread his fingers and pressed his hand flat against the ground, palm open. He remembered how Noah, when he was a boy, used to coax stray dogs by lying flat on the porch, whispering, "Let them come if they want." That memory stung, but it also gave Ethan courage. He didn't speak now. He simply waited, his body lowered, his hand an offering of stillness. Minutes dragged. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of sunlight, piercing through a crack in the boards. Thistle flicked one ear, then the other. His nostrils quivered, testing the air for threat or safety. His hooves shifted in the straw, scraping softly, and one twisted foreleg trembled under the weight. Yet he did not bolt. Ethan could hear his own heart pounding, louder than the distant call of a hawk overhead. Then it happened. Barely a gesture, almost invisible. Thistle leaned his head a fraction closer, nose lowered toward the earth. The faint warmth of his breath touched the back of Ethan's hand, a fleeting brush of air that felt like fire. Ethan did not move, not even to glance up. The gelding pulled back immediately, but the moment had already been given. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first thread of something Ethan had thought long buried. Connection. The day stretched on with chores, but nothing felt routine. Ethan carried firewood, mended a hinge on the back door, and shoveled snow from the path leading to the well. Yet his thoughts stayed inside the barn. Each task felt lighter because of that small moment, as if the horse's breath had stirred an ember inside him that he hadn't known was still alive. He realized that he had lived too long in silence without expecting anything to answer back. Now, even the slightest response from another living creature seemed enough to change the color of the day. That evening, he returned with a slice of apple in his hand. The fruit's sweetness filled the air as he cut it, and he remembered Sarah once saying that a horse could smell an apple before you'd even drawn the knife. He placed the piece on the straw, not offering it directly but leaving it within reach. He sat again with his hand on the ground. This time, Thistle sniffed the air, his ears twitching, his eyes dark pools of caution. He did not step forward, but after long minutes he stretched his neck, lips brushing the straw near the apple. He pulled back again, but Ethan did not sigh or speak. He knew this dance of hesitation was the only language the gelding trusted. Later, as the lantern flickered against the wooden beams, Ethan found himself whispering, "You'll learn I won't hurt you." His voice cracked on the last word, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for the horse or for himself. He leaned back against the wall, letting the night deepen around them. Outside, the valley was silent except for the low moan of wind rolling down from the Bridger Range. Inside, two figures, man and horse, shared the same breath, the same waiting. By the end of the week, Ethan noticed changes, small, almost imperceptible. Thistle no longer flinched when Ethan entered the stall, his ears still pinned back, his muscles still taut, but the trembling lessened. Once, when Ethan shifted his weight, the gelding took a step sideways instead of freezing altogether. It was progress measured not in strides, but in inches, in the space between fear and acceptance. Ethan wrote in his notebook at the kitchen table. He touched my hand today. Just a breath, but it felt like the start of something worth holding on to. The pencil shook as he wrote, the same way his hands had shaken when he buried Noah years before. But this shaking was different. It was the tremor of something fragile being born. That night, as he blew out the lantern and headed back to the porch, the stars spread bright above the valley. For once, the silence of the farm did not weigh heavy. It hummed with possibility, like a song waiting to be sung. Ethan knew the road ahead would be hard, the legs of the gelding would never straighten, and the world would never stop mocking weakness. Yet here, in the quiet space between fear and trust, he felt something close to hope. And hope, no matter how crooked its legs, was worth walking alongside. The first week passed in quiet persistence. Ethan rose with the frost, carried buckets of water, stacked firewood, and returned each evening to the dim stall where Thistle waited. Progress was measured in small mercies. The horse no longer turned his body completely away. His ears no longer flattened at every step. One night, when Ethan set an apple slice on the straw, Thistle stretched far enough to nibble before retreating. The victory was so slight that anyone else might have missed it, but Ethan carried it like a secret flame. Out in town, however, the story was spreading in louder tones. Bozeman was not a city where things went unnoticed. At Maple and Iron, the diner where the smell of bacon grease never left the walls, men hunched over their mugs of weak coffee spoke about Ethan. "Cole's lost it," one rancher muttered, shaking sugar into his cup. "Paid money for a cripple. He'll get nothing but vet bills." The others chuckled, their voices mixing with the clatter of plates. A young boy scrolling on his phone showed a blurry video from the auction, Thistle stumbling down the ramp behind Ethan's truck. The laughter spread around the counter, not cruel perhaps, but careless. News traveled faster than Ethan ever imagined. He wasn't part of social media, but Maya Rivera was. Maya, 16 years old and restless with the boundaries of a small town, had seen the video online. Unlike the others, she didn't laugh. She watched the way Ethan placed his hand on the dirt and the way the horse followed, however awkwardly. She felt something stir, the same reason she spent hours at the 4-H stables brushing manes and cleaning stalls. Animals understood silence in ways people often didn't. That night, she whispered to her mother that she wanted to help the farmer. Her mother, busy with laundry and tired from long shifts at the diner, shrugged, but Maya had already decided. The next afternoon, Ethan was repairing a loose board on the barn door when a voice startled him. "Mr. Cole?" He turned to see a girl standing at the gate, dark hair braided down her back, a notebook in her arms. She introduced herself quickly. Maya from down the road, part of 4-H, wanting to volunteer. Ethan frowned, unused to company. His instinct was to refuse. He didn't need anyone peering into his failures. But before he could send her away, Thistle shifted inside the stall, letting out a sound that caught Maya's ear. She stepped closer, her eyes lighting with a gentleness that reminded Ethan of Noah. Against his own habit, he nodded. Maya's visits became regular. She didn't speak much, at least not around the horse. Instead, she mirrored Ethan's patience, sitting on the straw with her hands folded, waiting. Sometimes she sketched in her notebook, quick lines of the horse's bent legs, his cautious eyes. "He's still beautiful," she whispered once, almost to herself. Ethan didn't answer, but the words sank deep. It had been years since anyone had called something in his life beautiful. Then came another visitor. one Ethan expected less. Lila Hart, the town veterinarian. She arrived in a dusty SUV with her young daughter strapped in the back seat, stopping only long enough to say she'd heard about the horse and wanted to check him free of charge. Lila was practical, brisk in her movements, her hand smelling faintly of antiseptic and hay. She examined Thistle's legs without judgment, murmuring facts rather than opinions. "The joints are under strain, but he's not in pain every second," she explained. "With the right care, he can live years, though not as a workhorse." Her voice softened as she looked at Ethan. "You didn't save him to work him, did you?" Ethan shook his head. She nodded once, approving in her quiet way, then added, "Keep him clean. Don't push him too fast. I'll check back in a week." But not all eyes were kind. One evening, Joe Bramble, Ethan's neighbor, leaned against the fence with a smirk. A retired veteran, Joe carried his bitterness like a badge. "What's the plan, Cole? Turn him into a lawn ornament? Folks already think you're cracked." Ethan didn't rise to the bait. He hammered a nail into the rail, the sound sharp in the cold air. Joe chuckled, spitting tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't warn you." Ethan went to bed that night with the weight of voices pressing against him, the diner gossip, Joe's sarcasm, the whispers of children watching videos online. Yet he also remembered Maya's sketchbook, the way she looked at Thistle without pity, and Lila's calm assurance that life was still possible. Between scorn and sympathy, he realized the horse had already become something larger than his stall. A mirror of how people chose to see brokenness. The next morning, when frost covered the valley again, Ethan walked into the barn carrying a pail of water. Thistle lifted his head, ears pricked forward, and for the first time did not shrink back when Ethan entered. The world outside might be filled with judgment, but in that small space, something was beginning to grow that no rumor could erase. The wind that cut across Gallatin Valley in late November carried the bite of winter. Ethan spent the mornings repairing fences, stacking logs, and feeding chickens that clucked irritably in the cold. Yet every hour his thoughts circled back to the crooked legs of the horse in the barn. Thistle moved cautiously, his body swaying with each awkward step. It was clear that standing took effort, walking even more. Ethan knew the world had written the gelding off, but something inside him rebelled. He had spent his life mending what others tossed aside: doors, broken chairs, warped planks. Why not this horse? One evening, Ethan set his lantern on the workbench in his shed. The flame flickered against jars of nails, old tools, scraps of wood stacked in piles. He ran a hand over a length of black walnut, weathered but strong. Slowly, an idea formed. Not to fix the horse entirely, but to help him bear his weight. He sketched rough shapes on the back of an envelope, braces that could cradle Thistle's forelegs without pinching. They would not cure him, but maybe they could steady him. The notion seemed foolish even as he drew it, yet the stubbornness that had carried him through years of solitude pushed him forward. For days, Ethan labored. He cut strips of wood, sanded them smooth, and padded the insides with pieces of leather from an old saddle. He scavenged rubber from a worn-out tire to cushion the bottoms. Each nail hammered into place carried a kind of prayer. That effort itself could create dignity. Outside, snow flurries dusted the valley white, muffling the world in silence. Inside the shed, Ethan worked until his fingers stiffened from cold and his breath clouded in front of him. When at last the braces were ready, he carried them to the barn. Maya happened to be there, sketchbook open on her knees. She gasped softly when she saw the contraptions. "You made those?" Ethan only nodded, setting them gently on the straw. Thistle lifted his head, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scent. His ears twitched nervously, hooves scraping against the floor. Ethan's voice was low, steady. "Easy, boy. Just a try." The first attempt failed. As Ethan knelt to guide the brace along Thistle's leg, the gelding jerked violently, nearly toppling them both. The wood clattered against the wall, and Maya jumped back. Ethan caught his breath, waiting, not forcing. Thistle's chest heaved, eyes rolling white with fear. For a long moment, Ethan considered abandoning the idea altogether. But he remembered Noah, his boy wobbling on a bicycle, refusing to let his father hold the seat for long. "Let me fall if I have to," Noah had said once, tears in his eyes. The memory pressed Ethan forward. The second attempt came with more patience. Ethan left the brace on the ground, letting Thistle sniff. He sat back, his hands still. Minutes passed, long enough for the barn to settle into silence again. Then, slowly, he reached out, guiding the brace gently against the twisted limb. Thistle trembled, but this time did not bolt. Ethan secured the leather strap with careful fingers, speaking in the low rhythm of reassurance. "That's it. Just wood. Just help." When both braces were finally fastened, Ethan stepped back. Thistle shifted uncertainly, his body stiff. Then he moved, one step, awkward but steady. The wood thudded against the floor with a sound that made Maya hold her breath. Another step followed, then a third. The braces creaked, the rubber edges scraping, but the gelding remained upright. His head rose slightly, as though surprised by his own balance. Ethan felt something burn behind his eyes. He pressed a hand against the stall rail, steadying himself. In that dim barn, with snow falling quiet outside, a miracle took place. Not the kind sung about in churches, but the small miracle of survival. Thistle walked 3 more steps before stopping, sides heaving. He lowered his head, not in defeat, but in exhaustion, and Ethan quickly unfastened the braces to let him rest. Maya clapped her hands once, softly, as though afraid to break the spell. "He walked," she whispered. Ethan only nodded, throat tight. He stroked the gelding's neck, his rough palm trembling against the animal's coat. "Good boy," he murmured, words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. That night, Ethan didn't write in his notebook. Instead, he sat on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders, staring out at the snow-blurred fields. His heart was heavy, but not with despair. It carried the weight of hope. A fragile, trembling hope that crooked things could still find a way to stand. He sipped from a mug of coffee gone cold, the taste bitter yet grounding, a reminder of simple endurance. Somewhere inside the barn, a horse with twisted legs had taken steps no one believed possible, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he had taken steps too. By December, snow blanketed Gallatin Valley in uneven drifts, turning fence lines into crooked white ridges. Ethan shoveled the path to the barn each morning, his breath rising in clouds, his boots sinking deep. Inside, Thistle shifted on his straw bed, his bent legs trembling less each day. The wooden braces leaned against the wall like a pair of weathered guardians. Progress was slow, fragile, but real. To Ethan, those halting steps had meant everything. Yet outside the quiet barn, the voices of the valley had grown louder. At Maple and Iron, the gossip thickened with steam from coffee pots. "He's wasting his time. one rancher said, slamming down his mug. "That animal should have been put down weeks ago." A woman stirred cream into her cup, shaking her head. "Saw him walking with those wooden things strapped on. Cruel, if you ask me. Better to let the poor creature go than make it hobble around like a circus act." Phones passed from hand to hand. Grainy photos, shaky videos of Ethan tightening the straps around Thistle's crooked legs. Each clip carried a caption, sometimes mocking, sometimes pitying, but rarely kind. Maya heard the whispers, too. At school, classmates teased her for playing vet with the crazy farmer. She clenched her jaw and said nothing. But at night, she biked through the cold to sit in Ethan's barn, sketching Thistle by lantern light. The horse seemed to steady under her gaze, as if her presence alone reminded him he wasn't invisible. Still, she worried. The cruelty of words could strike deeper than winter wind, and Ethan, she knew, carried scars words could reopen. The blow came on a Tuesday morning. A white envelope, damp from snow, lay in Ethan's mailbox. No return address, only his name scrawled in thick ink. Inside, a single page. To the Sheriff's Office of Gallatin County. We report an act of animal neglect. A farmer named Ethan Cole is keeping a disabled horse in unsafe conditions, with makeshift devices that may cause further injury. Immediate investigation required. Ethan read it once, then again, the words pressing cold into his chest. He stood by the fence for a long time, the letter shaking in his hand, the horizon blurred with falling snow. That afternoon, Deputy Ross drove up in his patrol truck, its tires crunching on frozen gravel. He stepped out, tall and broad, his badge catching the weak sunlight. "Got a call," he said, not unkindly. His breath fogged the air as he glanced toward the barn. "Mind if I take a look?" Ethan nodded silently, his throat too tight for words. Inside, Thistle shifted nervously, sensing the change in the air. Ross inspected the stall with professional detachment, checking the braces, the straw, the buckets. "You built these yourself?" he asked, tapping the wooden splints. Ethan answered with a single nod. Ross's brows furrowed. "Resourceful, I'll give you that. But some folks think this looks like cruelty, not care. They don't see what you see." Maya appeared then, breathless from her bike ride, cheeks flushed from the cold. She stepped between Ross and the horse, her small frame bristling with defiance. "He's not hurting him," she said quickly. "He's saving him. Nobody else cared. Nobody even looked twice." Ross studied her for a long moment, then exhaled, his sternness softening. "I'll file that the animal's alive, sheltered, and fed. But you'll need a vet's report, Cole. Within a week." He left the barn without another word, boots crunching against the snow. The silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. Ethan leaned against the stall door, the letter crumpled in his fist. He felt the old weight of judgment pressing down, the same weight that had driven Sarah away, the same weight that had crushed his voice at Noah's funeral. For a moment, he considered giving in, unstrapping the braces, letting the horse fade back into the corner of the stall until the world forgot. But then Thistle shifted closer, his muzzle brushing against Ethan's sleeve. It was the gentlest of touches, so light it might have been missed. Ethan froze, then slowly lowered his hand, palm open against the coarse mane. Thistle didn't flinch. His breath warmed Ethan's skin, and for the first time in days, the farmer's eyes closed against the sting of tears. That night, Ethan lit the lantern and opened his notebook. His pencil scratched across the paper, slow and deliberate. "They think this is cruelty. But tonight he touched me first. Maybe they can't see it, but I know. He's learning I'm not leaving." He closed the book and sat in silence, the sound of the horse shifting in the stall, a steady rhythm against the storm that howled outside. The storm arrived with a sound that felt older than language. Snow fell in heavy curtains, muffling the valley in white, while the wind dragged across the rafters of the barn like a restless spirit. Ethan shoveled his way through the drifts to check on Thistle. The lantern in his hand threw a halo of light onto the stall, where the gelding stood pressed against the corner. Muscles taut. Eyes wide at every groan of timber. The wooden braces leaned unused against the wall. Tonight was not for training. Tonight was for surviving the storm together. Ethan pushed open the stall door and entered slowly, the smell of hay and cold iron filling his lungs. He lowered himself onto the straw, his body aching from the day's labor, and leaned his back against the wall. Thistle shifted, but did not retreat. For a while, they sat in silence, the snow piling higher against the outside door. Ethan drew in a long breath, and for reasons he could not explain, words rose from a place he had long kept buried. "You should have met him," Ethan whispered, his voice almost lost to the howl of the wind. "Noah." The name trembled in the air, fragile as glass. His throat tightened, but he forced the syllables through. "He was 9, laughed at everything, rode a bike down the gravel road like he owned the whole world." Thistle's ears twitched at the sound, his head tilting slightly as though listening. Ethan pressed his palms against his knees, staring at the lantern flame. "Snowmobile," he said hoarsely. "Too fast. Too much ice. I told him not to, but boys don't listen. One wrong turn." His voice broke, and the sentence dissolved into the rattling of the storm. For years, he had carried the memory alone. The flashing lights, the white sheets, Sarah's scream. He had never spoken it aloud, not even after the grave was filled. Words had always felt useless, too small for the weight of what he carried. Tonight, in the company of a crooked-legged horse, the silence finally cracked. Thistle shifted closer, his hooves crunching softly against straw. Ethan didn't move, afraid to break the fragile thread. The gelding lowered his head, his breath warm against Ethan's sleeve. It was not comfort, not exactly, but presence, and presence was more than Ethan had allowed himself to hope for. He closed his eyes, letting the sting of tears burn hot, the first in years. "I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, maybe the world would forget," he admitted, his words ragged. "But it doesn't forget. It waits." Snow lashed against the windows. Ethan reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed the coarse mane. To his surprise, Thistle didn't recoil. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his body heavy with trust that was tentative, but real. Ethan exhaled, a long shudder that emptied years of silence into the cold air. "I won't let you go the way I let him," he said, his voice steadying. "Not this time." Minutes passed, stretched thin by the storm. When Ethan finally stood, his knees stiff, Thistle followed his movement with dark, steady eyes. Outside, the valley lay buried, every fence post softened under the snow. Inside the barn, something else had been unearthed. A confession, spoken not to people who would judge, but to an animal who asked nothing except that Ethan show up. Later, in the house, Ethan opened his notebook. His hands shook as he wrote. Said his name tonight. Said Noah's name. The horse listened. That's more than I've had in years. He shut the book gently, the sound of the storm echoing in the chimney, and allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, to sleep without waking in the grip of silence. The thaw of early January came with a strange stillness. Snowmelt trickled down from the eaves, the yard mottled with patches of mud and ice. Ethan spent the morning splitting logs behind the barn, his axe rising and falling in rhythm with his breath. Each strike felt like penance, though for what he could never fully name. Inside the stall, Thistle shifted carefully on his crooked legs, his body steadier than in the weeks before. The braces leaned nearby, waiting, while the lantern light caught the dust swirling in lazy arcs. The crunch of tires on frozen gravel startled Ethan out of his rhythm. He straightened, squinting against the pale winter sun, and saw a county truck pulling into his drive. The words "animal control" stenciled on the side glinted faintly. His chest tightened. He set down the axe, wiped his palms on his coat, and braced himself. From the cab stepped Deputy Hrse, broad-shouldered in his uniform, and beside him a woman in a heavy wool coat, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Mr. Cole?" Hrse greeted, his voice even but formal. "We need to take another look." The woman introduced herself curtly as Ms. Dillon, the county inspector. She didn't wait for an invitation. Her boots crunched across the yard as she headed straight for the barn. Ethan followed, each step heavier than the last. Inside, Thistle raised his head, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scent. Ms. Dillon's eyes swept the stall, the braces propped neatly on the wall, the buckets of fresh water, the bed of clean straw. She crouched, running a hand over the wooden splints. "Homemade," she murmured, writing notes. "Unapproved, risk of splintering or constriction." She rose, looking at Ethan as if he were the one on trial. "Do you have veterinary documentation for this animal?" Ethan's throat felt tight. He managed a rough shake of the head. "Not yet," he admitted. Dillon's pen scratched across the clipboard. Hrse stood behind her, his jaw set, but his eyes less certain. "Sir," Dillon continued, "this animal shows signs of severe deformity. Without professional oversight, your methods could be classified as neglect." The word landed like a blow. Neglect. Ethan swallowed hard, his fists curling at his sides. He wanted to shout that he had fed, watered, and cared for the horse every day since the auction. He wanted to tell her about the nights he sat in silence, about the way Thistle leaned against him in the storm, about the first steps the braces had allowed. But words tangled in his throat. He had never been skilled at defending himself with anything but work. Maya's voice cut through the heavy air. She had slipped in quietly, her cheeks pink from the cold. "He's not neglecting him," she said firmly. "He's the only one who's ever cared. You should have seen the auction. People laughed at him, called him worthless. Mr. Cole bought him when no one else would." Her eyes shone, fierce and unblinking. "That horse is alive because of him." For a moment, the barn fell silent except for the sound of Thistle shifting his weight. Dillon's pen hovered above the clipboard. She glanced at Hrse, then back at Ethan. "I'll allow 1 week," she said at last, her voice clipped. "You'll need a signed veterinary report stating this animal's condition and your ability to provide appropriate care. Otherwise, we'll have to remove him." She snapped the folder closed and turned toward the door. Hrse lingered, his gaze meeting Ethan's. Something softened in his expression, though his words remained formal. "Do what she asks. It'll be easier that way." Then he followed Dillon out into the cold. Ethan stood frozen in the lantern light, the barn suddenly too small for the storm raging inside him. His hands trembled as he reached for the braces, touching the wood he had sanded smooth with so much hope. Neglect. The word rang louder than the storm winds of December. He looked at Thistle, who stood watching him with steady, unblinking eyes. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought he saw a reflection of himself in that gaze. Broken, judged, but still standing. Slowly, he stepped into the stall. Thistle did not move away. Ethan pressed his forehead to the horse's coarse mane, letting the warmth seep into him. "They don't know you," he whispered, voice rough. "They don't know me either, but we'll show them." His hand slid down the gelding's neck, resting against the tremor of muscle beneath. That night, Ethan wrote in his notebook with a steadier hand than he expected. "They came to take him. Said I had a week. I won't let them win, not this time." He closed the book, the storm inside him tempered not by certainty, but by resolve. Outside, the valley slept under a pale sky, but in the barn, a man and a horse braced themselves for the fight to prove their survival. The Chinook winds came without warning, sliding down from the Rockies with a roar that rattled windows and shook the ground as if the valley itself were groaning. Ethan had been patching a section of fence when the first blast hit, warm and fierce, carrying dust and broken branches. The sky turned the color of bruised steel, the horizon blurred with swirls of snow whipped into the air. He dropped his hammer and sprinted toward the barn, heart hammering harder than the wind itself. Inside, Thistle was already pacing, his uneven legs slipping in the straw, his eyes wide with panic. Each gust made the rafters groan, and the lantern swung violently on its hook. The braces lay untouched in the corner. This was not a night for progress. It was a night to endure. Ethan stepped inside the stall, hands out, voice low, though it nearly drowned in the storm's howl. "Easy, boy. I'm here." But the wind slammed against the barn again, the door rattling like it might burst from its hinges. Thistle bolted sideways, nearly collapsing under his own weight. Ethan moved closer, steady but unyielding, until the gelding pressed against him, trembling so hard his muscles shivered beneath the coarse coat. Then, in a gesture that caught Ethan off guard, Thistle lowered his head and pressed his forehead against the farmer's chest. The weight was heavy, desperate, but it carried something else. Trust. Fragile. Untested. But unmistakable. Ethan's throat tightened. He slid his arm along the gelding's neck, holding him steady as another gust roared overhead. "We're not staying here," he muttered, "not with the roof ready to fly." He opened the stall gate, guiding Thistle toward the lean-to he had built weeks earlier from Joe Bramble's lumber. It wasn't much, just a slanted shelter against the barn's side, but its frame was braced, its walls low enough to hold against the wind. Step by halting step, Ethan led the horse out into the storm. The wind cut across them like a blade, lifting Ethan's coat, filling his mouth with grit and snow. Thistle balked at first, his hooves slipping on the frozen ground, but Ethan planted his boots firm and tugged gently at the rope. "Come on, just a little farther." The gelding's legs shook, but he followed, leaning into Ethan's shoulder with every gust. Together they crossed the yard, two shadows braced against the fury of the Chinook. When they reached the lean-to, Ethan shoved the door open and guided Thistle inside. The lantern flame flickered weakly, but held, casting a fragile glow against the walls. Straw cushioned the ground, and Ethan threw down fresh hay and a bucket of water, though he knew the horse wouldn't eat until the storm passed. He sank to the floor beside him, his back against the timber wall. Wind battered the roof, snow hissed through the cracks, but the small shelter held. Thistle stood close, his breath warm in the freezing air. Ethan rested his head back, eyes closed. For years he had faced storms alone, storms of weather, storms of grief, storms of silence. Tonight, with the gelding pressed near enough that their bodies shared heat, the solitude shifted. The storm outside was merciless, but inside, for the first time in years, Ethan felt less like a man bracing for collapse and more like a man standing with someone who would not let him fall. Hours passed before the winds began to ease. By then, Ethan's body ached from the cold, his fingers stiff, but he didn't move. He let the gelding rest against him, each breath a rhythm steadier than the storm. When the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks, it revealed drifts piled against the barn, the fences half buried, the valley scarred by wind. But inside the lean-to, horse and man had endured. Ethan rose slowly, rubbing warmth back into his limbs. He pressed his palm against Thistle's neck. The horse lifted his head, eyes calmer, ears forward. Ethan whispered, voice hoarse from the night, "Never again alone. You hear me? Not you, not me." The words settled into the straw, simple and unadorned, but true. Later, when Ethan wrote in his notebook, the letters scratched unevenly across the page. The storm tested us. He leaned on me, and I leaned back. Maybe that's all trust is, choosing to stand when the world tells you to scatter. He closed the book with a steadier hand than before, his body exhausted, but his spirit sharpened. The valley outside looked battered, but to Ethan, it had never felt more like home. The storm had passed, leaving the valley wrapped in silence as heavy as the snowdrifts. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, cleansed by the Chinook's fury. Ethan woke stiff from a few hours of restless sleep, his muscles aching from holding himself steady through the night. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The world was unrecognizable, fences buried up to the rails, trees bent low under ice, the barn roof sagging but still intact. The lean-to stood scarred yet standing, its timbers dark with moisture. Inside, Thistle lifted his head when Ethan entered. His ears pricked forward instead of flat, and his eyes, though rimmed with fatigue, carried a calm that Ethan had not seen before. The horse no longer pressed himself into corners or trembled at the shifting of shadows. He stood centered, balanced, as if something inside him had steadied during the night. Ethan laid a hand on his neck, feeling the warmth of muscle beneath the coat, and whispered, "You made it." The braces rested against the wall, unused since the storm began. Ethan hesitated before lifting them, afraid to undo the fragile peace of the moment. But Thistle didn't shy when the wood scraped across the straw. Instead, he sniffed the contraptions, his breath fogging against the leather straps, and stood still while Ethan fastened them. Outside, sunlight pierced the clouds, spilling across the barn in slanted beams. For the first time in weeks, the air inside felt lighter than the wind outside. Ethan opened the stall gate and stepped back. Thistle moved slowly, uncertain, but when his hooves struck the ground, there was no wild flinch. He took one step, then another. The braces creaked softly, the rubber pads thudded against the floor, but the horse's body stayed steady. Each movement carried an assurance that had been absent before. It was not grace, not beauty in the way the valley once measured such things. It was better. It was dignity. Maya arrived not long after, her breath white in the cold. She froze in the doorway, eyes wide as Thistle walked the length of the barn, halting but deliberate. He's not afraid," she whispered. Her sketchbook slipped from her hands, pages fluttering open to half-finished drawings. Ethan didn't answer. He stood by the gate, his hands gripping the rail, watching the animal move with something that felt dangerously close to pride. Thistle stopped, lifted his head, and exhaled long and slow. The sound echoed in the barn, filling the space where fear had lived for too long. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound wash through him. For years, he had been haunted by silence. The silence after Noah's laughter ended, the silence in the house after Sarah left. But this silence was different. It wasn't absence, it was presence. The kind that told him he wasn't alone anymore. Joe Bramble appeared at the doorway later, his cap pulled low, his face unreadable. He leaned against the frame, watching. "Didn't think he'd last the winter," he muttered. Ethan didn't look at him, but Joe stayed, arms folded, gaze lingering on the horse that now walked without trembling. He didn't offer praise, but when he left, Ethan noticed the old veteran's stride had softened. Even the hardest eyes could not deny what they had just seen. That evening, as the sun set behind the Bridger Range, the barn glowed in the last light. Ethan removed the braces and brushed the straw from Thistle's legs. The gelding lowered his head, pressing his muzzle gently against Ethan's shoulder. Not panic, not desperation, just a gesture of closeness, steady and unforced. Ethan stood still, letting the warmth of the breath soak into his coat, and felt the sharp edges of his solitude dull. Later, at the kitchen table, he opened his notebook and wrote, "Today he walked without fear. The valley will forget this storm, but I won't." Fear left his steps, and maybe mine too. He closed the book and sat in the dim light, listening to the barn creak softly against the settling snow. Outside, the valley seemed healed, at least for now. Inside, something far more fragile had shifted. A horse learning to trust, and a man learning to breathe again. The days after the storm carried a strange kind of quiet. Snow still lay heavy across the valley, but the air was gentler, softened by the Chinook's retreat. In the barn, Thistle moved differently now, his steps halting, yes, but no longer haunted. He walked without flinching at every creak, without the constant tremor that once rattled through his frame. Ethan noticed it each morning as he mucked the stall and tightened the braces. Fear was slipping away like smoke, leaving behind something steadier, something closer to trust. But Ethan was not the only one drawn to the barn. Maya came more often, her sketchbook filled with quick, restless drawings of the horse, the braces, even Ethan himself when he wasn't looking. She didn't chatter the way most teenagers did. Instead, she watched, her pencil scratching as though each stroke might anchor something fragile to the page. One afternoon, as the lantern burned low, she confessed softly, "Sometimes at school, I feel like him. Like everyone's staring, waiting for me to trip. My family, we don't fit here. Too many whispers." She didn't elaborate, but Ethan understood. He had heard those whispers before, felt them on his own skin. He nodded, a quiet recognition. Lila arrived later that week, her daughter asleep in the back of the SUV while she carried a small bag of supplies into the barn. She checked Thistle's legs with firm but gentle hands, her breath puffing white in the cold air. "He's healing in his own way," she said, adjusting a strap. Then, more softly, almost as if speaking to herself, she added, "People think being a single mother makes you weak. They don't see the work, the nights without rest. They don't see what it costs to keep going." Ethan caught the flicker of weariness in her eyes, the same exhaustion he carried in his bones. He wanted to tell her she wasn't weak, but words caught as they always did. Instead, he handed her a cup of coffee, steaming and bitter, and she accepted with a small smile that said enough. Even Joe Bramble, the neighbor who had scoffed at Ethan's efforts, lingered more than before. One evening, he leaned against the fence while Ethan brushed straw from Thistle's coat. His face was hard, but his voice quieter. "You know," he muttered, "I came back from overseas with a limp that never healed. Folks looked at me different. Didn't matter that I'd fought for them. All they saw was the limp." He spat into the snow, his shoulders tense. "Guess I didn't want to see another broken thing trying and failing." For once, his words weren't sharpened by mockery. They carried the weight of his own shame, tucked behind his gruffness. Ethan didn't argue. He only kept brushing, the steady strokes filling the silence. Joe stayed until the light faded, then grunted a goodbye, and walked home through the snow. It was the closest thing to friendship either man had offered in years. By the fire that night, Ethan reflected on how the barn had changed. What began as a shelter for a horse no one wanted had become something else entirely, a gathering place for those carrying unseen scars. Each person who stepped inside seemed to recognize something of themselves in Thistle's crooked legs, his stubborn survival. Maya with her sketches, Lila with her exhaustion, Joe with his limp, even Ethan with his hollowed-out silence. Somehow, the horse had bound them together, not by perfection, but by brokenness. Thistle shifted in the straw, lowering his head onto folded legs. Ethan reached over the stall rail, his hand resting against the coarse mane. "We're not alone, boy," he whispered, his voice steady. And for the first time, he believed it. The thaw of late winter arrived slowly, creeping into the valley with pale mornings and afternoons that smelled faintly of wet earth. Snow still clung stubbornly to the fence lines, but patches of bare ground showed through like scars healing across the land. Ethan led Thistle from the barn into the weak sunlight, the braces strapped snugly around the gelding's twisted legs. The air was crisp, the kind of air that seemed to hold its breath for something to happen. Thistle paused at the threshold, nostrils flaring as he tasted the cold wind. He shifted his weight, ears flicking toward the distant calls of crows. Ethan gave him space, standing a few paces back, rope slack in his hand. "When you're ready," he said softly. The gelding stepped forward, hooves sinking into the softened ground. Each step was slow, deliberate, but the tremor of fear was gone. He moved as though the storm had blown the shadows out of him. Maya arrived on her bicycle just in time to see them. She skidded to a stop, her breath catching when she realized Thistle was not just walking. He was searching. His legs wobbled, the braces creaked, but his body leaned into motion. He pushed forward, awkward at first, then faster, his head rising with a sudden spark. For a heartbeat, it looked like stumbling. Then, astonishingly, it became rhythm. Thistle broke into a trot. It wasn't smooth or graceful. His hooves struck the earth unevenly, and the braces knocked together with a hollow clop. But he trotted, each step carrying the determination of an animal who refused to remain still. Ethan felt his chest tighten as he watched, his hand gripping the rope loosely. He did not guide. He did not hold. He simply let the horse move, free in his imperfection. Maya's eyes brimmed. "He's running," she whispered, though it was barely more than a child's trot. She fumbled for her phone, then stopped, realizing the moment wasn't meant for a screen. She clutched her sketchbook instead, as though to anchor herself in the reality of what her eyes were seeing. Joe Bramble appeared at the edge of the fence, leaning against the post with his arms crossed. He didn't speak, but Ethan noticed how tightly the old man's jaw clenched. Even Lila, who had driven up with her daughter bundled in the passenger seat, stepped quietly to the gate. Her eyes softened as Thistle made another clumsy circle, determination outweighing weakness. For once, nobody spoke. They only watched. The trot lasted less than a minute before Thistle slowed, sides heaving, legs quivering with effort. He stopped, head low, steam rising from his body in the chill air. Ethan stepped forward, resting his hand on the gelding's neck. "That's enough," he murmured, his own voice shaking. "More than enough." Thistle leaned into him, exhausted but steady. Ethan felt something stir deep inside, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Pride. Not the pride of proving people wrong, but the pride of seeing life rise from a place where no one believed it could. His throat ached as he whispered, "Good boy." The words hung in the air, small but heavy with meaning. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open. The fire snapped in the stove, throwing shadows across the room. He wrote slowly, each letter deliberate. Today, he trotted. Not graceful, not strong, but free. I thought I'd never see it. I thought I'd never feel it again, the weight of hope moving faster than fear. He closed the notebook and pressed his hand against its cover, as if sealing the memory inside. Out in the barn, Thistle rested on the straw, his legs stretched awkwardly, but his breathing even. The valley was quiet, the moon silver over the mountains. For the first time, Ethan felt the land itself was holding its breath with him, waiting for what might come next. And in that silence, brokenness no longer felt like an end. It felt like the beginning of something stronger. The letter arrived on a pale morning in early March, slipped beneath the door while frost still clung to the windows. Ethan found it when he came in from the barn, his coat damp with dew. The envelope bore no county seal, no harsh handwriting like the anonymous complaint, but a printed letterhead, Wind River Equine Rehabilitation Center, Wyoming. His brow furrowed as he unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the careful sentences. They had heard about the horse, it said. About Thistle. They specialized in equine orthopedic recovery, with advanced equipment and specialists who could provide the highest quality of care. The closing line landed heavy. We would be honored to take him into our program, free of charge. Ethan set the letter on the table, staring at the ink until the words blurred. Outside, the valley stirred awake. Chickens clucked. A crow called from the cottonwood. The mountains held their calm silence. But inside, his chest tightened. It was, on the surface, a gift. A chance for Thistle to live. Under the care of experts, with machines and knowledge Ethan could never match. Yet the thought of letting the horse go felt like prying open his own rib cage. Maya was the first to speak when she saw the letter that afternoon. She had pedaled to the farm, hair messy from the wind, and froze when Ethan handed it to her. Her lips moved as she read. Then her face crumpled. "They want to take him?" she asked, voice sharp. Ethan nodded, unable to say more. Maya hugged her sketchbook tight to her chest. "No, he belongs here. With you. With us." Lila arrived later that week for her routine check. She read the letter carefully, her expression unreadable. "It's not a bad offer," she admitted. "They can do things for him that you can't. Physical therapy, hydro sessions, things most horses never get." She glanced at Ethan, her eyes softer. "But care isn't only about science. Sometimes it's about who shows up every day, no matter what. You've already given him something they can't measure." Her words hung in the cold barn air, heavier than the smell of hay. Even Joe weighed in, though in his own blunt way. He leaned against the fence, chewing on a piece of straw, and said, "You let him go. People will say you quit. You keep him. People will say you're selfish. Either way, someone talks." He spat into the dirt and added, "But that horse follows you, Cole, not them." Then he walked away without waiting for an answer. Ethan lay awake that night, the letter on the table beside him. Memories tangled in his mind. Noah's laughter echoing down the gravel road, Sarah's voice telling him silence had become unbearable. The storm when Thistle pressed his head against his chest. He thought of the trot, uneven but alive, the breath of hope that had risen in the barn. Could he let go of the one creature who had looked at him and not seen failure? Could he risk believing that belonging wasn't temporary? The next morning, he made his choice, not with a speech, but with action. He opened the barn door and left the stall wide. Thistle stepped out into the yard, ears twitching at the sharp morning air. Ethan held the rope loosely, but did not tug. He whispered, "If you want to go, you'll go. If you want to stay." His words trailed off, lost to the breeze. Thistle sniffed the open air, his legs stiff but steady. For a long moment he stood at the threshold, the world spread wide before him. Then he turned, not away, but toward Ethan. He stepped closer, his muzzle brushing against the farmer's rough hand. It was not grand, not dramatic, just a choice, quiet and deliberate, to stay. Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs in a rush. He stroked the gelding's neck, whispering, "We'll make do, together." The letter from Wyoming lay forgotten on the table, its promises of advanced care fading against the simple truth of loyalty given freely. That evening, Ethan wrote in his notebook, "They offered him a better future. He chose me instead. Maybe that's what grace looks like. Not being given the best, but being chosen when you're at your worst." He closed the book, his hand steady, his chest lighter than it had been in years. Outside, the valley glowed with the last gold of sunset, and in the barn, a broken horse had chosen his place. Spring pushed into the valley with slow insistence, melting the last patches of snow until the fields glistened with mud and new grass. The cottonwoods along the creek shivered with pale leaves, and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth. Ethan had grown used to mornings that began not with silence, but with the sound of hooves shifting in straw, the steady rhythm of a creature who had chosen to stay. Still, the barn and the yard carried scars, broken boards from storms, fences patched with wire, and the memory of laughter from townsfolk who had called the horse worthless. It was Maya who first suggested marking the change. She stood by the barn one afternoon, her sketchbook balanced on her knee, and said, "He should have a place that's his, something that says he belongs." Ethan looked at her, puzzled, until she pointed at the gate. "There. People pass by and see nothing but wood. But if they saw his name, they'd know this isn't just any barn. It's his." The idea spread quietly. Lila brought up the notion at the diner, her words casual but sure. Joe Bramble overheard, and, without comment, brought Ethan a wide plank of cedar salvaged from his own shed. Good wood, he muttered, setting it down as though it had no weight. Maya volunteered to carve, her pencil tracing the letters first on paper, then across the smooth surface. Even Hrse, the deputy who had once stood ready to take the horse away, stopped by with a box of nails and a hammer, saying only, "Figured you'd need these." On a Saturday morning, the little group gathered. The air carried the scent of sawdust and coffee, and the sound of children from the 4-H club echoed faintly across the fields. Ethan watched as Maya carved each letter slowly, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. When she stepped back, the words shone clear. Thistle's Gate, where dignity stands. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had never asked for this, never wanted attention or a banner over his home. Yet, as the cedar board was lifted into place and Joe's strong arms held it steady, something inside him softened. He drove the first nail himself, his hand trembling slightly, the hammer striking true. Each blow seemed to anchor not just wood to wood, but memory to place. When the sign was raised, the barn looked different. It was still weathered, still patched, still imperfect. But now it bore a name that spoke of survival, of choice, of belonging. Thistle stood in the yard, ears flicking, as if sensing the shift. Maya reached for her sketchbook again, capturing the moment as the gelding lifted his head high, crooked legs steady, beneath him. Neighbors slowed their trucks as they passed on the road, eyes lingering on the new sign. Some shook their heads, some smiled, but all looked. For the first time, Ethan didn't care what judgment followed. The farm no longer belonged only to solitude. It had become a place with a story, written not in ink but in wood, sweat, and the steady steps of a horse no one else had believed in. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch, notebook open across his knees. The sky burned orange behind the Bridger Range, and the air carried the faint sweetness of spring grass. He wrote, "His name hangs on the gate now. They'll see it when they pass, and maybe they'll understand. Or maybe they won't. But it doesn't matter. He has a place, and so do I." As the light faded, Thistle wandered close to the porch, his shadow stretching long across the yard. Ethan reached out, brushing his hand against the gelding's muzzle. For once, the man who had lived in silence felt no need to say more. The gate bore the words now. The world could read them, or not. Either way, they would stand. The first Sunday of April dawned with a stillness that felt almost holy. The snow had melted from the fields, leaving the earth dark and damp, ready to be turned. From the porch, Ethan could see the Bridger Range standing clear against a pale blue sky. No clouds, no storm pressing down. The church bell in town tolled faintly, carried by the wind, though Ethan hadn't set foot inside in years. He sat with a mug of coffee steaming in his hands, watching the barn where the new cedar sign gleamed in morning light. Thistle's Gate, where dignity stands. The gelding emerged into the yard, ears forward, his legs moving with the careful rhythm they had fought so long to earn. Each brace struck the ground with a muffled sound, steady instead of frantic. He no longer pressed himself into shadows, no longer shivered at the groan of rafters or the whistle of wind. He walked into the sunlight, as if he had been born to meet it. Ethan rose slowly, joints stiff, and met him halfway. They stopped within reach of each other, neither needing a rope. Ethan placed his hand against Thistle's neck. The horse exhaled, warm breath fogging the cool air between them. There were no witnesses this time, no Maya sketching, no Lila checking straps, no Joe muttering from the fence. Only the two of them, alone in the quiet that now felt less like absence and more like presence. Ethan whispered, "Thank you for staying." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years. Years of silence. Years of loss. Years of believing brokenness was the end of the story. Thistle shifted closer, his muzzle brushing Ethan's sleeve. The gesture was unremarkable to the world, but to Ethan it was everything. An answer, a promise, a vow made without words. He remembered Noah's laughter, Sarah's leaving, the loneliness that had almost buried him. All of it still lived in him, scars that would never fully fade. But standing here, with the horse that had been mocked and abandoned, Ethan realized scars didn't mean endings. They meant survival. The valley stretched wide around them, fields waiting for seed, sky waiting for storms yet to come. Life would not ease simply because one horse had chosen to trust, or because one man had chosen to keep showing up. But in this small circle of earth, there was enough. Enough trust to keep walking. Enough silence to share, enough presence to heal. That evening, Ethan opened his notebook one last time. His handwriting was uneven, the pencil worn to a stub. He was broken. So was I. But we stayed. And in the staying, we became whole enough. He set the notebook aside, not needing to write more. Some truths no longer required proof on paper. As dusk settled, Ethan sat on the porch again, the sky burning orange over the mountains. Thistle stood nearby, his silhouette framed by the fading light, head lifted as though he carried the valley itself. No applause, no fanfare, no witnesses. Just a man and a horse, both scarred, both stubborn, both still here. The silence between them deepened, not empty but full, a silence that promised, "We are not alone." And that promise was enough. And now, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. Your voice means more than you think. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey of hope and healing between humans and horses. Every story carries a promise, and the next one may be waiting just for you.